Halstead. I chair the Department of Religious Studies here. And Scott Paeth, my colleague, and I are going to do some work on evolution. And since this is Spirituality Day of World Catholicism Week, issues of the spirituality that goes along with the discussion around evolution in the United States, and then a different point of view that I'll take after Scott gives a presentation, after Catholic thought, and then our Catholic spirituality, or better yet, several Catholic spiritualities that may well flow from Catholic creation theology in lively and interesting discussion with the evolution discussion in the United States of America. So I'm going to get out of the way, and evolution in the United States of America. What do we know about that?
Good afternoon. My name is Scott Paeth, and as Dr. Halstead said, I teach in the Religious Studies Department here at DePaul University. And so my brief today is to give some background in terms of how did we get to the place where we are in the United States when it comes to the discussion of the theory of evolution, particularly vis-a-vis our religious discourse. So what I'd like to do is to begin simply kind of lay out some history. And in the process of laying out the history, also make a couple of core observations. The first observation is that the objections among many Christians, and particularly Protestant Christians, to evolutionary theory were not, or let me put it this way, they were often biblical. But they weren't only biblical. They were also theological in the broader sense. Furthermore, they were social and also fundamentally moral objections. And I think we have a way of conceiving of the discourse about evolutionary theory here in the United States where we think that it all comes down to a commitment to a particular religious ideology that excludes evolution as a possibility. And there's certainly a great deal of that. But much more fundamental to the objection to evolution within the United States is the suspicion on the part of Protestant Christians and evangelical Christians that there is something fundamentally damaging and dangerous about evolutionary theory. And this is an aspect of the discourse about evolution that goes back to its very origins. So with that as a prefatory comment, let me go into a bit of the history. First of all, it's important to recognize that as every scientific theory in existence, evolutionary theory went through a fair degree of vetting when it was first proposed by Charles Darwin in the mid-19th century. And for a number of people, it was initially objectionable on scientific grounds. They perceived that there were gaps in Darwin's presentation of the theory, that he had not fully made his case in favor of evolution. For example, the great Harvard biologist Asa Gray was an early opponent of Darwin's and argued vociferously for a very long time against Darwin's theory of evolution. And for a lot of the mid-19th century scientists, there was an admixture of scientific and religious commitment that was at stake. At the time, to be a scientist was to be what was then called a natural philosopher. So basically, to do science was understood to be to do something which was a branch of philosophy, often a branch of theology. So that many of the most prominent scientists in Great Britain during the time of Darwin were actually clergy. Darwin himself, as you may know, considered a career in ministry. And despite the popular mythology, he did not opt against it because he decided he didn't believe in God because of the theory of evolution. He decided against it because he thought he'd be a lousy minister. Nevertheless, he went on to develop the theory of evolution in response to what he found as a result of his journeys on the Beagle. And he came back and he began to formulate the theory, and when he finally presented the theory, the initial objections to it, although there were some religious objections to it, the initial objections to it were scientific. But again, the scientific objections were not easily extruded from the religious objections. And as he began to win over the scientific community, the religious objections remained. And those religious objections were, first, that the theory of evolution was contrary to the Bible, contrary to how the Bible described the creation of the world. Secondly, that it was contrary to good theology, insofar as it seemed to deny the idea of human beings as being created in the divine likeness and image. And third, it was seen as being immoral because it reduced human beings to the status of animals, and thus on that basis made it impossible to understand human beings as have some kind of transcendent destiny or higher moral purpose. Now I bring these things up because these are basically the same kinds of objections that you hear today in the conversation about evolutionary theory. So in a sense, we seem to be stuck in a particular kind of discourse within at least the Protestant and particularly the evangelical religious community about what evolution means. Now, as the scientific community began to adapt itself to evolutionary theory, the religious community was continuing to express these concerns. One of the most powerful opponents of evolutionary theory at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century was a person named William Jennings Bryan. And if you know anything about the history of the theory of evolution, you've heard that name before because he was ultimately the stand-in prosecuting attorney for what became known as the Scopes monkey trial. But if you know anything about American history generally, you know that William Jennings Bryan was actually one of the great liberal progressive politicians of the 19th century in the United States. He was an ardent opponent of the economic exploitation of the poor. He was a great champion of populist causes. He was a worker on behalf of unions. He was also, for a time, he was the American Secretary of State, despite also being a pacifist. He ran for president, unsuccessfully, 3 times, and was understood by the bulk of Americans prior to the Scopes trial as being on the leading edge of progressive thought in the United States. So how is it that now, when we think about him, we generally think about him as being some kind of retrograde scientific Neanderthal because of his opposition to evolutionary theory? Well, it had to do with his role in the Scopes trial. He took up a very public and prominent stand against evolutionary theory. But it's important to understand why he took that stand. It goes back to the objections that I mentioned. He saw the evolutionary theory as unbiblical. He saw it as being theologically problematic. But perhaps most fundamental, he saw it as being morally dangerous. Because from Bryan's perspective, evolutionary theory was tied up with the idea, which was not part of Darwin's original theory, of the survival of the fittest, and the idea that the best would be the most advantaged. So, taking his cue from social Darwinism, Bryan believed that this was an ideology that would result in the oppression of the poor, the downtrodden, and the outcast. He thought it was a scientific justification for class stratification and division. And he thought that it was a recipe for the exploitation of the poor. Now, I think I venture to say that that's a part of the story that most people, when they hear about William Jennings Bryan, don't hear a lot about. They generally think about him solely in terms of a guy who's a fundamentalist Christian who's opposed to the theory of evolution. Now, all of that was true, but that story can't be understood unless it's understood in the context of Bryan's social concern. Now, of course, as you probably know, the Scopes trial ended in a Pyrrhic victory for the prosecution, insofar as Scopes was found guilty of having taught evolution, was given a nominal fine, which he refused to pay, and the entire event was seen as such a debacle from the perspective of the people who had engineered it. And it's important to note, by the way, from a historical perspective, this was engineered by the Chamber of Commerce of Dayton, Tennessee, along with the ACLU and along with Scopes, in order to get attention and to get revenue for the city of Dayton. It didn't turn out very well for Dayton. But it also led to a very interesting phenomenon in terms of the American teaching of science. Because what happened was that in the following 30 years, the way that we decided to deal with the theory of evolution in the United States was simply not to talk about it. It wasn't talked about by Christians, and it wasn't talked about in high school science classes. It ended up coming back to the fore only with the renewal of science education in the early 1960s, which came as a result of Sputnik. Exactly. What happened was that, for good reason, the Americans looked at Soviet success in getting a satellite into space and realized that we were losing the scientific contest with the Soviets, and so there was a big push to renew scientific education in the United States. And along with that came a renewal in the teaching of evolution. So it began to be reincorporated into science textbooks. It became an important part of high school biology curricula once more. And it was at that point that the evangelical community that had been very quiescent about evolutionary theory, because it was something they could safely ignore because it wasn't in their classrooms, they began to get very riled up about it again. Now, contextualize this a little bit. We're talking about public school teaching in the early to mid 1960s. We have the renewed teaching of evolutionary theory. That's not all we have. We also have Supreme Court cases in the early 1960s that decided that, one, teacher-led prayer was no longer appropriate for public school classrooms. The beginnings of sexual education in public school classrooms, and a number of other things. Oh, and well, there was another Madeline Murray O'Hare thing. but basically, what you had was the sense among evangelicals that their way of life and their understanding of life, morality, and God were under public attack. Because within the public schools, and most of these people were sending their kids to public schools, within public schools, you were having God being removed and Darwin being inserted. And the same problems that were at issue at the very beginning, biblical, theological, social, and ethical, came up once more in the 1960s. The same arguments that this is contrary to Genesis, that it violates the idea of human beings being created in the divine image, that it's socially dangerous, it reduces us to animals, and creates a basis for immorality. When you think about this in the 1960s, coupled with the beginnings of the sexual revolution, you can sort of encapsulate it in the slogan sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So, it seemed, if you were standing within the evangelical community during that time, it seemed as though God gets kicked out of the public schools, Darwin gets brought into the public schools, and all of a sudden, it's sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And, well, race, I didn't even want that would bring me into a whole but it's absolutely part of it. You're right. I mean, there was the question of racial segregation, racial integration, and again, the possible threat to the way of life of many people who saw their status as whites, particularly in the South, being damaged by the integration of blacks within their community, and that also stood in there as a very dangerous precedent. So, I could go on for some length of time about the attitudes within the white evangelical community, particularly in the 1960s, so you still see remnants of it today, about race, and how understandings of race factor into their problems with evolution, and a lot of the concerns that they even today have in some corners about interracial marriage, for example. But I'm going to leave that aside for the moment. So in the 1960s, the reimportation of evolutionary theory into public school curricula creates sort of a domino effect. It repoliticizes the evangelical community. It gets them much more deeply involved in their local communities and ultimately in the national discourse about questions of morality. These are where the seeds of the moral majority, so-called, are planted, and where the conservative backlash within, for example, the Southern Baptist Convention emerges from all of this. And what happens is that from the mid to late 1960s through the 1970s, and particularly in the 1980s, you begin seeing the formulation of strategies that are developed in order to allow for a place to discuss the biblical teaching of evolution, or what they consider to be the biblical teaching of evolution, alongside or instead of the Darwinian theory. So what you wind up with initially is the development of what was called creation science, an attempt to do science from the standpoint of the Bible. Right? So you say, well, the Bible says the world was created in 7 literal days. Then the Bible, then we have to make the geological evidence conform to 7 literal days of creation. If the Bible says we were created separately from other species, then we need to make the biological evidence conform to that principle. So this was, initially this idea of scientific creationism was promoted and inserted in some public school curricula, and it was not found by the Supreme Court. So then what happened was that over the period of the last 20 or 30 years, we have had numerous attempts to massage various forms of scientific creationism in order to make them palatable within the U.S. legal system. So scientific creationism didn't work. There were other attempts to do this, using different variations on the scientific creationism theme. Then in the mid-1990s and into the relatively recent past, there was the development of what was called the intelligent design movement. The intelligent design movement, very interesting movement. I could spend some time talking about that if you like. But the intelligent design movement took a different tack. They tried to argue that what they were doing was not a religious theory, that their understanding of the idea of the creation of the world in the way that they understood it, although it might have religious implications, was not itself a religious theory. You didn't have to scratch that theory very hard in order to realize that, despite what its proponents may have said, it was really fundamentally a religious theory and thus did not measure up to the standards that were set by the Supreme Court in terms of what would constitute a scientific theory. There was, of course, another very logical problem with the intelligent design theory, namely it had absolutely zero support within the scientific community. It had no support among biologists, it had no support among chemists, it had no support among geologists. It had some nominal support for some little corners of it among some kinds of mathematicians that specialize in probability theory. But even there, it was not in any way, shape, or form widely embraced as a possible alternative to evolutionary theory. Nevertheless, it was presented by its proponents for a very long time as being the kind of the Christian-friendly answer to evolutionary theory, because it said, well, we can't say that it is a God that created the world, but we can say that there must have been some kind of intelligent designer. And if you want to call that intelligent designer God, by all means, call that intelligent designer God. We withhold judgment. Again, it was a very thin veneer of scientific incredulity that they were laying across what was fundamentally a religious theory. But the biggest problem for the intelligent design movement was that, having decided that this was their strategy, they made the mistake of actually announcing that this was precisely their strategy. So that they actually said, in documents that were later subpoenaed and used in court deliberations on this, basically that this is a way of getting around the Supreme Court bans on teaching of religion in public schools. Of course, there was the Dover, Pennsylvania case that sort of put the nail in the coffin of the intelligent design theory in the public schools. The most fascinating little anecdote from that case, from my perspective, was the moment when they subpoenaed all of the early drafts of the textbook that was under consideration there, which was called From Pandas to People. or pantheism, excuse me. They subpoenaed all of the early drafts. And what they discovered was that this textbook, in its early drafts, had actually proposed a theory that was called creation science. They called it creation science. And then by the time it was ultimately published and used in the Dover, Pennsylvania classrooms, it was called intelligent design. What's interesting is that in the intermediate drafts, somebody had done a poor version of a find and replace computer function in their, they basically, how Microsoft Word where you can go find and replace. Well, what they had done was that they had, the phrase was design, was creationist or something like that. So they substituted all through the book the term creationist with the term design proponent. So that way they got rid of the whole notion of creationism, or so they thought. But because they had done a poor job of the find and replace function in their word processor, they wound up with the word crit design proponentists, which, as many people in the evolutionary community pointed out, is a perfect example of what evolutionary scientists understand to be a transitional form. In other words, you have the early stage, you have what it evolved into. Now we have a transitional fossil within the text, demonstrating its evolution from creationism to design proponent. The irony was rich. Anyway, so the latest iteration of this has been what is called the teach the controversy. The substance of which is simply to say, well, we're not saying that you have to teach that intelligent design theory is true and that evolutionary theory is false. But you ought to at least expose your students to the idea that there's a controversy. And just don't let the students make up their own mind, but simply teach them that there is a controversy. And that is the latest way to say, this is how we want to get people to talk about evolution in the public classrooms. I'm short of time, so let me just conclude by saying what I said at the beginning. For Protestant and evangelical Christians, the fundamental issue that underlies their objection to evolutionary theory is their concern that it violates fundamental religious tenets, that it is contrary to the Bible, which they understand to be the basic datum for Christian conception of the world. It violates a theological conception of the creation of God, the creation of human beings as the image of God. It violates their concern that society be set up and established justly, and violates their concern, and it raises concerns among them that it will undermine what they see as the fundamental basis for morality, which is rooted in a theological principle that we are accountable to a transcendent God. So, in light of these objections, it's important to understand that conservative, evangelical, Protestant objections to evolutionary theory can simply be reduced to reveling in ignorance. While there may be some of that, it's ultimately rooted in a deep religious and moral concern for the creation of a world that is just, that is safe, that is well-ordered, and that is reflective of their own deepest values. So whether or not you yourself are conservative, Protestant, evangelical, and whether or not you agree with conservative Protestant evangelicalism in terms of how evolution fits into the larger framework, it's very important to understand the legitimate concerns that they bring to this debate and how that has formed this conversation that has taken place throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century about how evolution should be understood and taught in American public schools. So, thank you very much for your time.
Let's take a minute. Your questions or comments on Scott's presentation?
Yes, please.
I'd like to suggest that that their remarks or that their beliefs are based on ignorance. But it's not ignorance of the evidence for evolution, but ignorance of the nature of science. That is, that there is work that's been done that shows that people who reject evolution tend to be people who don't understand how science operates and the limits of scientific understanding. And I think that's what we've done a poor job with in this country, is that people don't understand the strengths and limits of science. And by not teaching people the nature of evidence and what it takes to understand what we know and how science is changing, we leave them open to believing that it's one or the other. So it is a level of ignorance, but it's not an ignorance of, it's not what you set up as ignorance. It's not an ignorance of that. It's an ignorance of the nature of science and the feeling that there has to be one or the other.
And just to be clear, I mean, I'm not saying that there isn't ignorance in play here, but I agree with you that that is the fundamental problem.
So we don't want to call them ignorant and say we win because we're smarter than you or we have the evidence. It's really, there are different ways of looking at the world. They use different methodology. They have different assumptions. And, I don't know that you want a world with only one or the other. Both of them provide, I've read material, would you be able to comment on the Pope's stand on evolution? Because I've read translations that lead me to believe that the church supports evolution, the science of evolution, but holds dear to that religion gives meaning to humankind. So there are limits.
I'm going to leave the detailed discussion for the Pope's stand on this.
Oh, okay.
Because he's going to know in much more detail than I am. But yeah, I mean, my understanding is that the Catholic Church is broadly supportive of evolutionary theory as it's taught. And by the way, so are many Protestants, including many evangelical Protestants, who really do understand the science behind it and what's at stake. And most of the time, this gets categorized as you've got your creationists over here, and then over here you've got your theistic evolutionists. And the theistic evolutionists are the people who believe, as you're suggesting, that you don't fundamentally have to choose between religion and science. By the way, the fundamental problem that I think you're pointing to about the nature of the ignorance has to do, to narrow the conversation even further, to this question of what is meant by a theory.
I don't. I've heard people say, well, scientists, to a scientist, a theory is the result of hypotheses that withstood at the time. And the problem is that the lay public doesn't understand what a theory is. I don't know if that's where you're going. It's way deeper than that. It's way deeper than the definition of the term.
Well, I agree it's deeper, but I think that's really the crux of
the nature of evidence.
But that's part of the nature. When you're talking about a theory, that's what you're talking about, is the question of how you evaluate and judge evidence. I mean, I agree with you that it's, that when you even starting with the question of, what constitutes a theory, you then kind of have to go deeper than that. But really, the conversation begins with this question of what does it mean to talk about a theory in the context of science. I have this conversation with my wife, with whom I say, we're talking about evolutionary theory, and she says, well, it is just a theory. Oh, wait a second here. What do we mean by that? Because until you begin to answer that question of what you mean by theory, the question of whether something is ever just a theory remains very much at stake. Yes, sir.
Two very quick points. The first one, this is a very helpful argument to give, particularly for Europeans, either scientists or religionists, because there's a lack of understanding of American culture, and there's as much prejudice among scientists about the detail of religious consciousness as there is among some of these folks about the complexity of science you're talking about. So there's a kind of prejudice against religion in some European religionists and some scientists. Secondly, I often use the early controversy as an example of liberation theology, because it's basically H.L. Mencken and the power structure of the East Coast and the intrusion of controls across the South on education from outside that's being resisted, of which evolution becomes a symbol, and with the multivalent symbolism that you talk about, which is helpful, because a lot of the rhetoric, and again, the racist rhetoric, it gets to the moral issues and the cultural issues that a whole way of life is being questioned.
Well, actually, that still goes on today. I think one of the biggest difficulties that we have in talking about evolution in public life today doesn't come from fundamentalist Christians, but comes from the attitude of the so-called neo-atheists who hold religion in all of its forms in contempt, and who believe that Exactly, they don't understand it. And the problem I have is, you say to Richard Dawkins, and nobody, I think someone should say to Richard Dawkins, if you really want people to accept evolutionary theory, quit telling them that they have to choose between your theory and their religion. Because as long as they think that that's the only option, they will always choose their religion. And so it's going to raise on Richard Dawkins would just say, no, this is not a binary choice. Obviously, more than that. But it would certainly go a long way if people didn't think that it was a question of simply Dawkins and Hitchens and you and me and all these other intellectuals holding them in contempt for their religious belief, but understood that this is actually something in which there is a lot of room for discourse in the attitude of intellectuals. It's not simply contempt for religion.
But wouldn't you say, though, that the vast majority, probably, of Americans of all of all religious persuasions, probably Europeans too, are much more likely fideists, in that they say one is one and one is the other, and we don't have to worry about how they relate?
If you're talking about most people most of the time, I think that's right. I mean, we live our lives, unless you're someone like me who works on this issue, or someone in science who has to deal with this question of how they're going to get funded next year when state legislature is controlled by people. We're trying to decide whether to cut funding for science, or whether your state legislator who has to hear from his constituents about how they should be teaching evolution. These things probably don't come up for you very often. It's only when they enter your radar screen that you're forced to think about it at all. And it's at that point that one hopes you have resources available for understanding the interrelationship between science and religion to enable you to make an informed judgment about the relationship. But again, to go back to the initial point, I think one of the things we've done a poor job of in this country at least, is giving people a grounding and understanding how to reason that will enable them to, when they're confronted with that issue, have some basis for making an informed decision.
That's a rough question. Last one.
Scott, when Darwin came out, also at the same time there was a big discussion about the geological evidence and how that contradicted Genesis. Is there any, and there's not as many, there are some parallels there, but they kind of end, there's no really, the age of the earth doesn't really affect your morals or your theology except for this narrow interpretation of Genesis. Is there anything you can take away from how that evolved? I mean, that no one cares about that part. No one cares if I talk about volcanoes or plate tectonics in a class. Is there anything instructive in that analogy?
What you're suggesting is that the ultimate problem that people had to do with this idea of human beings evolving from other animals.
Right.
And you're right about that, because even Bryan is a great example of this. William Jennings Bryan, who was well known to have said during the Scopes trial that he cared more about the Rock of Ages than the Age of Rocks. Nevertheless, when asked about the issue, did not consider himself to be what was called a young Earth creationist. A young Earth creationist is someone who believes that the Earth was created in 7 literal 24-hour days. Bryan's perspective was much more along the lines of that each day was a symbolic representation of an epoch, an indeterminate period of time during which things could have arisen. So for him, the fundamental problem, this is why as progressive he was strongly suspicious of evolution, was precisely the moral and social implications of human beings evolving from other animals and the implied class stratification and oppression of the poor that would go along with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So things on the table. Most people they're perfectly willing to live their lives in multiple categories. And you got your accountant for some things, your doctor for something, your rabbi for something. And you just leave it apart and life goes on. Yeah, I kind of like that. And then we've got the problem on the table of the epistemology of science. What the theory, what counts as facts, what the nature of the kind of knowledge produced, that's kind of on the table too. Then we've got all the things of human well-being, human morality, human sense of self in the universe. All these kind of issues are on the table. And I frankly like the idea of, we Catholics don't have a dog in this fight, let's go home and stay fideistic. But for some of us, you can't quite do that. Oh, jeez. There we go.
The lights.
Can you change the lights, please?
Oh, yeah.
So let's go to the Pope. Somebody brought up the Pope. Who brought up the Pope?
I did.
Oh, you brought
I
up the
did.
Pope. So let's read the Pope.
Let's read.
As a starting point. I'm not saying we're going to like what he says, or agree with what he says, but it's DePaul and it's at university, and so we got to engage the Pope in a Catholic university. So let's take an old Pope, Pius XII. The year is 1950. The encyclical is on human generation. A pivotal text that is written or is published 5 years after the end of World War II, and all that involves. So if it's published, give it 3 years in the writing phase. Got to pass through a number of people to make sure everybody's on board. So it's the late 40s, published in 1950. This Pope, and here's the part I want to read you. 2 sections that are vital. If William Jennings Bryan in the United States, and I'm going to make a mythological figure, a composite figure, call him Jerry Falwell, in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, if they're concerned in this evolutionary issue about, in America, morality, sense of self, I'm a son of child of God, not an evolutionary product of some mindless product, morality, sense of self, what were the other 2?
The Bible, and
Yeah,
Bible,
biblical.
theology, society, and morality.
Yeah. So the Pope's not concerned about those American issues. He's concerned about other issues. So, but the point that's in common here is that debates about evolution, they're always in a much wider historical, philosophical, political, psychological, group psychological context. Here's the context the Pope is worried about in 1950. If anyone examines the state of affairs outside the Christian fold, he could have said, if you were more honest, and inside some places as well. But if anyone examines the state of affairs outside the Christian fold, that person will easily discover the principal trends that not a few learned men are following. Some, imprudently and indiscreetly, hold that evolution, which has not been fully proved either in the domain of the natural sciences, explains the origin of all things. Not most things, not many things, all things. And audaciously support the monistic and pantheistic options that the world is in continual evolution. You can hear him into a cosmology. So we now have, if we're not much concerned about politics and race and all those things, he's concerned in his context is going to be cosmology. How does evolution fit into a broader vision of what the cosmos and the cosmic process is all about? And therefore, God. Communists, this is my favorite line in the entire encyclical, I must say. We got all these people that are audaciously supporting monastic and pantheistic options of the world and community, and communists gladly subscribe to this opinion so that when the souls of men have been deprived of every idea of a personal God, those communists may more efficaciously defend and propagate their dialectical materialism. So there's his political concern, as well as his cosmological concern, in which this now pastor of the Universal Church is going to be concerned with evolution. Such fictitious tenets of evolution which repudiate, here comes the epistemological moral part. Such fictitious tenets of evolution which repudiate all that is absolute, firm, and immutable have paved the way for the new erroneous philosophy which, rivaling idealism in all of its many forms, immanentism in its forms, those pragmatists in their multiple forms, have assumed the name existentialism, we can now lump them all together, since it concerns itself only with the existence of individual things and neglects all considerations of their immutable essences. Neglects. Okay. What is it that evolutionary theory, scientific theory, as well as dialectical theory, as well as, what are they missing? All these other characters, which of course, by the time we're done, are going to be wrong. And number 8, there is also a certain historicism, which attributing value only to the events of man's life, not attributing value to the next dimensions of reality, heaven and hell, or whatever else is out there beyond human death. There is also a certain historicism, while attributing value only to the events of man's life, overthrows the foundation of all truth and absolute law, both on the level of philosophical speculation and especially the Christian doctrines. That's his concern. I'd say he's got as much on his mind and on his plate as did William Jennings Bryan or our pal Jerry Falwell or any others. But it's different kind of concerns. But what I hope you're getting from these three articles, 5, 6, and 7, here's the context that he's going to write about and thinking about his thoughts on evolution and his teaching on evolution is going to fit into this pattern. Okay? Such that when any of us think about evolution, well, there's all sorts of domino effects. The spin-offs are huge. A systematic thinker is going to want to get the whole system, not just one little piece of it. Down to 36 is the absolutely pivotal. After going on now for the next 21 things, and he can go on, I must say, and it's incredibly dense, but it's readable. For these reasons, the teaching and authority of the Church does not forbid that, in conformity with the present state of human sciences and sacred theology, the teaching of the Church does not forbid research and discussions on the part of men experienced in both fields, taking place with regards to the doctrine of evolution, insofar as it inquires into the origins of the human body, as coming from pre-existent and living matter. Ladies and gentlemen, keep your discussion going of the evolution of the human body. No problem with that at all. Make sure that you know what you're talking about. That is, know some scientific epistemology, know some religious epistemology, know some scientific method and its strengths, its limits, know some theological methodology and its strengths and its limits. And then have a lively chat with each other, inquiring into the origins of the human body as coming from pre-existent living matter. But the Catholic faith obliges us to hold that souls are immediately created by God. You can talk about the evolution of the body, but what do you do with this thing about the soul? Now he's presupposing that what a human being is a combination of body and soul. That's kind of Aristotelian, kind of Platonic vision. That's in the back of this. If you want to think outside of those anthropological categories, that human beings aren't human souls, now you get some other creative things that you can do, and we'll say more about that later on. But here in 1950, this particular teacher is using an anthropology that understands things in terms of body and soul. An anthropology that I frankly want to avoid at all costs. But what can you say? However, this conversation in which you discuss evolution, keeping this notion of holding God does something immediate in the birth of a life, however this is done in such a way that reasons for both opinions, that is favorable and those unfavorable to evolution, be weighed, judged with the necessary seriousness, moderation, and measure. Some of those things that Scott was mentioning earlier, that another group wants done. Some, however, rashly transgress this liberty of discussion when they act as if the origin of the human body from pre-existing and living matter were already completely certain and proved by the facts which have been discovered up to now, and by reasoning on those facts. So he gets into slap about to those people who he was mentioning earlier, who frankly don't want to invent what he understands to be the more complicated discussion and ignore that part of the Catholic faith God really creates the soul. That's the Pope part. What's important to my mind in this is that these discussions are welcomed, encouraged, and supported, or at least tolerated if he's having a bad day, with caution to make sure that you do it well, and be careful of those people that overstate their case on either side. He says on one side, I want to expand to either side. Makes sense. Now we get into the heart of what I want to say. Is, how did he ever get to writing something like that?
It's a different genre.
Yeah. And how does he get there to writing in this papal genre? Try this. We need an epistemology here. for doing Catholic theology. And I want to sort out two groups of Catholics at this point. There's the majority of us who just kind of get up in the morning and leave our lives fragmented, and it's perfectly fine. And then there's a handful of people that every once in a while have to put the pieces together such that there is an intellectual coherence in their lives that's going to include philosophical assumptions clearly articulated about epistemology, metaphysics, cosmology, as well as engaging in contemporary scientific conversation as well as political scientific. There ought to be an intellectual harmony in there, at least for a few minutes of the day, before we go back to our normal lives. That being the case, how do you go about thinking in the Roman Catholic theological tradition, which is a little bit different than the Roman Catholic popular tradition, both of which have their value? Two vital things that you must deal with, that is the tradition. Whether you like it or not, if you're under Catholic theology, you've got to deal with biblical sources. You don't have to agree with them, but you've got to engage them. You can deal with them a dozen different ways, but you've got to engage them. And then the story of the thinking community in the Catholic tradition, 2,000 years, you've got to deal with 2,000 years of thought. That's just, you have to do that. You got to deal with philosophy of the last couple of thousand years and science of the last couple of thousand years. You got to deal with that one. And the second thing you have to deal with is part of that was tradition. Now you've got to deal with the religious experience of individual people. That is, talk to me. Tell me your deepest intuitions, your deepest sensibilities, your deepest experience of yourself and your place in the world. Tell me your religious experience. Tell me your experience of life, birth, death, love, forgiveness, presence. Talk to me about those things, and then we take them seriously. Those are sources for theological truth. Some of these are definitely not empirical. Matter of fact, you can even challenge you and say, is that a delusion? Or what is that? But you got to take it seriously. So, religious experience of those first Christians, subsequent Christians throughout history, and then your own religious experience, or lack thereof. You've got to deal with that as part of your way of getting at theological truth, your way of your formulating your understanding of humanity, and make sure you also grapple with traditional statements, traditional texts, like the Bible or like the Creed. I believe in God, the creator of heaven and earth. The liturgical feasts, Easter Vigil, we're going to read Genesis in the Roman Catholic tradition. We're going to, the first reading of the thing, you're going to listen to the 7 days of creation. You've got to deal with that. How you deal with it, get creative. When you do that, part of this religious experience that generates this kind of curious language, biblical language, you get, St. Paul looks around, takes a look at his world in which he lives, pays attention to his own inner experience, and he says, for God's sake, as wacky as this world seems, as goofy as I listen to the politicians, the priests, the Roman priests, the Greek priests, the Christian priests, the Jewish rabbi, I find myself at one with God. There is a certain peace, a certain oneness. I find myself justified. I'm a creep, I've done all sorts of nasty things, and yet nonetheless, I find myself justified. His language. It's a term I would never use. But he used it, and so I need to understand what is it that this guy's experiencing that he's then going to write the epistle to the Romans and other epistles. Other words, you don't like justification? John sees much of the same thing in the Gospel of John, and John at the end of his life, after thinking about this a long time, can say, God so loved the world that he gives his only son. Oh my God. Really? I would think God would be ticked off at this world. I would think God would abandon this world. I'm not sure there is a God who's remotely caring about this world, but John can say, I got to set something for you. God so loves this world. Other people are going to just give a name to Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us. Not only does he love us from a distance, he takes on human flesh, and his name is God with us, the Christmas celebration. Or you might like this one. Don't worry about it. You're worth more value than many sparrows. don't you understand? The very hairs of your head are numbered. You're of more value than many sparrows, says Matthew. And Brian said, just to make that absolutely clear, here's a healing. Here's a feeding. Here's a raising from the dead. Not a bad world becomes the religious experience of these founders. That is, and this is, to my mind, the most important epistemological point I can make. Catholic theology does not start in empirical reality. It starts with the experience of Christ. And then you begin thinking. In light of this experience of Christ, the tradition conveys, which I experience to some degree, my thinking starts there. So therefore, some of it cannot be empirically verified, just like lots of other things can't be empirically verified. It can be reasonable, but not empirically verified. And now here comes where creation theology fits. It's a since-then type of sentence structure. Since justification in Christ, since closeness with Christ, since the grace of God. Any of those words get at the same reality. Since then, since Christ, then what else seems to be the case? What else must be true? What else is the way reality is? Since Christ, then what? A whole number of questions have captured the imagination of Catholic intellectual tradition. One of them that has not captured the imagination of Catholic tradition is, where does all this start? All that just simply gets assumed. The questions that are really interesting and have haunted the tradition is this world in which we exist real? Or is it part of the imagination of something? Does this world in which we live have its own substantial reality? Their answer is, of course, yes. Tell me about the moral quality of this world. Well, contrary to all beliefs, and contrary to everything that kind of common sense would have you believe, this world is good, 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 very good. And the human beings in it are created in the divine image and likeness. Contrary to what you might think, if you go to a number of places and look at the horrible things, look at the things that we do to each other. Horrible was a value judgment. Let me take that word out. The human beings are living in a good and real world, and they're created in the divine image, so they may not act like it all the time. Moreover, just the question that haunts, does this world in which we live, this good world in which we live with these characters in which we live, is there any final destiny to it? Is it going anywhere? And the Christian answer is, much to the surprise of many of us, yes. Individual lives are on their way to resurrection. The corporate life, the story of history, is the movement toward, what shall we call it? The New Jerusalem. Okay, you like that one? Don't like that one? How about this one? New creation. I'm not sure what the word is, but a final completion in the hand of God. Early Christians, and so in the biblical period, and using biblical sources primarily, you wind up with an interesting set of questions, but not the question of where does it all come from. That's just kind of assumed. Yeah, it comes from. But then those biblical types get forced off into the world as they do their traveling and engaging in other ideas, and they meet a whole group of people that say the world is eternal. The world didn't have a beginning or an end. The Christians got to engage that conversation. The world is a part of the God. It's a fragment of the divine body. You've got to engage such a question. And then you begin to think, wait a minute, if the world doesn't have a beginning or an end, the world is eternal. You now have two eternal principles operating in this way. But I thought we believed in one God, the Father Almighty, the creator of heaven and earth. But if there's two eternal principles, is there one God? No. What must we say about that philosophy then? If you're going to keep the one God out of the biblical, the Jewish tradition. Is the cosmos in which we live part of the body of God, part of a fragment of God, or a break-off of God? And therefore the world is somehow, lovely word, divine. No, there's one God. The world cannot be it. And so as a way of, so this creation thought, so well, where does the world come from then? Well, since it can't be this and it can't be this and it can't be this, but it is real, where did it must have come from? Well, contrary to the Stoics, contrary to all sorts of common sense, creation comes from nothing, ex nihilo. But it's not a physical or a psychological nihilo, it's a metaphysical nihilo. So now what you got to do is wrap your brains around nothingness. But not physical nothingness, or not emotional nothingness, or not just I'm tired and I don't want to do this anymore. It's metaphysical nothingness, in contrast to physical somethingness. I think I've understood this doctrine once, for about that long in my 45 years of thinking about it. I had it for an instant, and then it zipped away because I can't do metaphysics that well. It just doesn't stick with me. But that's what they're doing. And so I'm going to continue to work on trying to understand absolute nothingness, which has a destiny, which is good, from which the Creator God creates, and then it continues. The last little piece, and then I want to stop so that we can engage each other, is later on a whole group of other questions as the tradition evolved. Once we developed universities in the Middle Ages, those theologians, they're every bit as creative as anybody in this place, and they get to imagining and asking questions as well, building on the past, because they have to pay attention in the 12th, and the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century. They're also paying attention to their religious experience 1,000 years later and to the tradition that they've inherited. And they ask some new things. Well, what can you say about miracles? And they answer the question, of course. What's the source of miracles? And do miracles actually exist? Some say yes, some say no, of course. They ask the question, why does God create anything at all? It's like, okay, we've got this creation from nothing, which has a destiny, which is good. Why did he do it? Which to my mind is the most fascinating question. Why would God bother creating the world and history and involving himself in it? And why does God bother creating you or me or any of us? A wonderfully fascinating question. Why does God bother? And of course, as you would expect, very different answers get given, depending upon the religious experience, rooted in the personality of the person who's giving the answer. And all of them then get celebrated in the Catholic tradition. For some people, why does God bother creating? Well, that's just what you do when you love. If God is love, what does love always do? It creates something. Well, it's like God, this is wild now, God must create. Because love has no other thing it can do. It can't just sit and repose on itself. God must create. Well, of course, that really raised a few hackles, because who are you to say God must do anything? No, God didn't create because he must do because of his own character. No, God created because, well, that's just what you do when you are a rational being. You express your rationality in external things. People write books. People give talks. Painters paint. What God does is creates a universe because that's what a rational person does. At which point, a whole other group of people are going to say, that wasn't rationality. That's artistic beauty. God is the great artist who paints. Because he has to. Because he wants to. No, God is the one who creates out of love because love requires it. No, God is the one who expresses himself in reason because reason necessarily does that, even though divine reason we're not quite certain. A lively conversation that's all dealing with the question, not where does it come from, but why does it exist at all? And then, in the 20th century, or in the late 19th and 20th century, comes this, well, what is the physical origins of this universe? Questions that were kind of taken for granted well, it's just here, and well, never really thought about it. And then a very curious kind of discussion emerges in America, or emerges in Europe among these movements here. 5, 6, and 7, the emanation, all those characters. And so a different kind of question emerges in the late 19th and 20th century that it never crossed the mind of people earlier, like the physical origins of this whole thing. So the Pope can then say, well, you know, I have no idea. But you know, it would be wonderful if the scientists, using their methods strictly, and the theologians, using their methods strictly, got involved in a lively conversation. Nobody oversteps their intellectual bounds, and people talk. And they all respect their respective disciplines. And the grand, wonderful, old question that now takes a new form is, what is the nature and how is it that God acts in the world? If God is a causal factor in the world, what is the nature of divine causality? Is it something like a human cause, that you just have an idea, take some will, and go do something? In which case now miracles make good sense. I don't buy that. But does God become the grand puppeteer? There are several options which you can all chat about. Here's one. This is the last one that I've done. If God's nature is to love, and love is by its very nature expressive, so you just have to create something, how do you act as a causal factor in the world? By control. And by letting people run their own thing and destroy themselves and pick up the pieces. It doesn't quite work. Even I wouldn't let some people do certain things and self-destructive. How about this? The causality of love itself. God's mode of causality in the world is simply by being the divine self. And therefore the church ought to be doing the same thing. By being loving, rational, thoughtful, engaging, forgiving, God draws history and God draws individuals into himself. The mode of divine causality is not the causality of power, dominance, control. Even in an evolutionary process. The mode of divine causality is simply by being a loving, gracious, rational, thoughtful self. And letting people be drawn to it. The conversation continues in the Catholic intellectual tradition. Now dialogues with these evolutionary thought thinkers, and who knows where we will be in another 150 or 200 years. Please, that's it. Please.
One of the things I find fascinating with this kind of Protestant Catholic discussion is that where we as Catholics are challenged intellectually by evolution is more in the evolution of doctrine, church, and sacrament. I mean, Newman, I think, was more destabilizing than Darwin for us with his development of doctrine and his interpretation of infallibility. And the Second Vatican Council's recognition that all the sacraments came from somewhere and potentially can go somewhere is really threatening to people who like the control model of God rather than the loving model of God.
Yeah, this can be terribly threatening. If you're heavily, and I need safe, stable thing, and put them in verbal formulas, which I can then grasp to you, this can scare the bejeebers out of you. But the tradition, at least part of the tradition that I celebrate most is, yeah, there is something immutable, unchangeable, stable, and you will experience in your moments of bliss, ecstasy, prayer, awe. So the spirituality that goes with this, I left this piece out. The spirituality that goes with all this thing is, you have to look at this process, this historical thing in which this 15 billion years or whatever it's going to be thought of as in 5 years from now when there's something new happens. You understand in awe and wonder at the mystery of the process that we're involved in, the people that we are involved in it, and the divine one who the tradition has talked about and who you can easily in your moments of sublimity experience yourself. So yeah, it can be threatening, but I particularly define it that way.
I certainly thought it was interesting that when you were going on metaphysics and you got stopped with nothingness, and that's where you were drilling down and wondering where to go with that. It struck me as somewhat uncharacteristic for a Catholic to be stuck with nothingness on their metaphysical journeys. Isn't it being? The metaphysics of being is such a characteristically Catholic place to go.
Yes.
And then our realist ontology. This whole business about actualization and potential, all of that. Is it just that you got that, you understand that, you got that kind of figured, it's this nothingness that is this problem?
Yeah.
Because I think the ontology, the realist ontology and the focus on being, which is so characteristic in Catholic metaphysics, works well with evolutionary theory. At least there's your bridge concept, right? How is it that you're stuck with nothing?
Because I just don't get it. Because I'm so into being in process development. It's like my psychology works that way, my political theory works that way, my scientific, everything works that way. And now I've got this curious doctrine given to me by a tradition that says, stop this entire thing that you take so easily for granted and feel utterly at home with. It's a created thing. And it stands in opposition to me. That's phenomenal to me. And I just think part of my own and anybody's growth and maturity, getting that question, why am I here at all? You know, out of all the possibilities, just biological, out of all the possibilities that could have happened when my father loved my mother, I'm here. I find that stunning. And so I want to understand nihilo.
Okay.
So as to understand being, I think, more profound. Like there's no reason why I'm here other than, I don't want to call it chance. I prefer my experience of divine love. Get that a part of your spirituality and let that become part of who we are. That ought to change your guilt, chains. That's what I see. Tell me what else you're thinking.
How do you balance the concept of ex nihilo, God created out of nothing, and then you see progressive evolution, change?
Yeah.
What is the substance of of nothingness? And then from where do things begin and change and progress? That's some kind of conceptual conflict.
Yeah, when Anselm realized, he inherited ex nihilo, so he had to deal with it. He did this thing about when God creates from nothing, he doesn't complete his creation. Interestingly enough, God creates certain things complete and finished from the very beginning. God creates the seed of other things. And God creates other things. What an interesting creator. God creates other things half done. And so, the way I put it, I think, Anselm, you are one brilliant fellow. Things like the first principle of the natural law may well be complete right from the very beginning. However, all human progress, God didn't create it complete. All human ideas, all human social structures, economic, those are all incomplete. And so part of the spirituality, okay, since God created things, some things complete, you ought to figure those out. Those things that God created incomplete, my dear people, finish them. So I look upon social life marvelously incomplete when God created it. So we got to finish that. Means developing political, social, economic structures that are just because God didn't finish that for us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean,
He was so clever.
a lot of mystery we're trying to comprehend.
Yeah.
What is incomprehensible in a sense.
Yeah. But like the Pope here, I want to keep certain things unchangeable, immutable, and all that. And when I say, well, what are they? Well, the first principle of morality, the first principle of metaphysics, divine love. But all the rest of the stuff, you're on, folks. Figure it out. Working with the divine creator, finishing it off. Please.
Okay. I'm just a student, and I can say most of this conversation has gone way over my head, but I feel like there's way too many assumptions being made, like the first principle of blah, blah, blah.
Oh.
You're just, I mean, I just,
Yeah. I'm
I don't know
sorry.
what they are, but I mean, it just seems to me, just sitting here and watching this conversation happen, that you're like taking a whole bunch of things for granted.
Yes, I
Did
am.
you really consider them before you made that decision? Like, and then you're talking, and you sort of like threw out, like, religions that say, like, oh, maybe we were created, a piece of God, so we've actually existed over time. I mean, even that spark of creation, coming into existence from something eternal, I'm just, I can't even say what I'm talking about, but it seems like you're throwing out a lot of stuff
Yes.
that's really valid in other places in the world.
Yeah. I think in one's own intellectual maturation, every one of those ideas ought to be considered. Every one of them. And then as you're considering them, say, okay, here's the implications of it. Got it. Does that resonate with my religious experience? Does that resonate with my rational thinking? Does that resonate with the broader community's thinking? To the best of my knowledge at the moment, doesn't quite resonate.
But in the broader community, are you talking about like your little neighborhood in Chicago, or are you talking about?
Oh no.
Yeah, are you talking about the world?
I'm talking about the world.
Because there's a lot of people that think. This is a silly conversation. I'm like.
No, it's a wonderful conversation.
But the other thing is.
So that's why it's faith.
But it's faith regardless of what other people think. It just blows my mind.
As they have faith with regardless. No, it's faith in communion with what other people think.
I mean, wouldn't you? I don't know. I don't feel like I'm in the conversation that we're supposed to be having right now. But the point that I'm trying to make is that, like, I feel like you observe the world through your own religious experience, through your spirituality, but also through your senses, and through communing with other people, because we all have Jesus in us, regardless of, we all have God in us, regardless of what religion we practice. We're all, creations of God. So if I look at a Muslim and I see truth, or I look at an atheist and I see truth, I can learn something from them, or a Hindu, something that's completely out of my little neighborhood. I see truth.
Yes.
And how can you just throw that out and be like, oh?
So those parts that
Or
I
are
find-
we throwing out?
Yeah,
I'm
I'm not throwing
misunderstanding.
out at all. I think I'd say in the conversation with all of those, and also the non-believers, they are some of the most helpful people I find. You say, let's listen closely, and then here's the points of similarity. That's easy. Those similarities are always easy. Here's the differences. And I'm different. The Christian tradition is different than these others. And then one makes an act of, humble faith. I hope it's humble. If it's not humble, you're in trouble.
The point where I'm making a disconnect, I think, is that I feel like when we make that distinction and we say I'm different, then we tend to make policies and stuff based on racism or ethnocentrism. We create a difference that doesn't really exist. Like, isn't humanity more important than
Sometimes that happens, and when it does, it needs to be corrected.
I'm sorry, I'm getting way off.
No, I think what you're saying is important, but I'd want to emphasize, personal, you must, or I would hope maybe not must. I would hope that one would examine all the options. Points of commonality, the moral realm is normally the easiest. But points of significant difference, and then comes a very humble faith. To say that God is incarnate in human flesh without compromising the divinity, a uniquely Christian doctrine, very different than any of my Jewish, Muslim, or other dialogue partners. Yeah, we just simply, that's my faith, and their faith is something different. let's go all go out and beat up the bad guys who want to blow up the world.
One more thing to say, it's actually related, but sorry, I really carried away.
I'm sorry?
We're talking about metaphysics and the concept of like nothingness and progression, like how we progress. And I've read like various things, and they're talking about how like when matter was created, so was time and space. I mean, so progress. I mean, and matter essentially enables progress because with matter comes like concrete time and like things have to move along a sort of progression. It's not like I just
You've been reading Augustine, huh?
I mean, it's sort of in and out, like, but anyway, how do the concept that God could just create human progress and like be like, okay, that was fun, and it's like if he created anything at all, it would progress whether it wanted it to or not, wouldn't it?
I don't know. To be continued. What else is on your mind? We have 5 minutes or so, please.
I'm a historian with great theological deficits, but it seems to me that this document I find fascinating because he's acknowledging evolutionary theory much abused. Actually, he's not acknowledging theological theory much abused in the events that had ended 5 years before the promulgation of the encyclical, right? So the racial Darwinism of the Nazis. And I guess my question is, just because he's so Germanophile and so anti-communist that he will mention the one and not the other in the document as being worthy of condemning. The other question I have, it seems to me, is what do creationists do when nature goes awry? In other words, when your explanation together with what you said about St. Anselm, which makes such great sense, is that it allows things to evolve, it allows things to develop, so that we don't have to deny the goodness of God in the face of horrific natural events. Which I think, and my question is, what does a creationist do with that?
A creationist says that God is. I mean, when you talk about things like earthquakes, hurricanes, and tsunamis, there are a lot of strategies. Some creationists don't really have a theory about it; they just sort of throw up their hands and say it's a mystery. Others assume that God is engaged in some form of sort of righteous punishment of the wicked. And you saw a bit of this, for example, after the hurricane in New Orleans, when people like it was Jerry Falwell or one of those other guys made comments to the effect that those punishments for New Orleans for its wickedness, which didn't explain how the French Quarter was left completely untouched by the events. But that's a common strategy, particularly among conservative, among political evangelicals who see themselves as sort of kind of being divine, though a natural disaster equals God's judgment. But what underlies that is an understanding of God's direct sovereignty over nature, so that nature doesn't do anything that God doesn't directly want it to. As for myself, I much prefer an idea of a natural world that's left open to its own freedom without direct divine intervention. Certainly for many creationists, all things in nature must ultimately be the result of God's direct providential action. Thank you.
Yeah, Nazism is a thing of the past in 1950 for this man. Communism is now on the radar screen. The grand Fuller text is fascinating to read when they say, who's he mad at here? Who's he mad at here? Who's saying that? And to read those is to read it, play Jeopardy, to play like a Jeopardy game.
Yes.
And say, okay, who's in back of this? And then why is he saying what he's saying? It's fun. But by now the Nazis are has-beens. Let's go after communists.
He thought the Nazis were an aberration.
Yeah.
Jim, can I make an observation about the encyclical? Because I was struck by it. One element of it in particular was his allowance for the discussion of evolution. He says we allow the discussion of evolution. But he's very clear it's evolution of pre-existing and living matter. And it seems to me that what he's doing there is he's making an important qualification. Talk all you want about evolution of pre-existing living matter.
Yes.
But you'll be beyond the pale if you say either that you have an evolutionary theory that accounts for the creation of matter per se, or that you have an evolutionary theory that accounts for the creation of life out of non-living matter.
Yes, because you've got the doctrine of ex nihilo.
Right.
So those other two things have to be off.
You've also got to have final cause and formal cause working in the universe. The strict evolutionists had only introduced it to material and efficient causality, and so the two big causes were gone.
This is part of the problem. He's caught in this neo-Thomist linguistic system, so he's not dealing really with the tradition. He's dealing with Leo XIII's affirmation of neo-Thomism. So even his comment about the soul is a very particular definition of soul, which of course if you get into the Scotus thing or you go all the way back to Augustine, it's more complex than he was enlightened enough to deal with. So that the tradition is much wider than the kind of neo-scholasticism which he was trapped in. And so the first question, I think, was already answered in the sense that he wasn't even thinking about that. The presupposition is the creation without reflecting on it, including the creation of life, but I suspect he would be more open to that if those categories were even on his scanner.
If he could have the joy that we get of multiple anthropologies,
Yeah.
I suspect he would have had the good sense to do some other things here. But it's, they just, right now I'm working on Benedict, and that body-soul stuff that I think he doesn't believe at halftime, but he uses the language. It just drives me crazy. Just break with that damn language system. Okay, what can I say?
But I think you made the point that you just have to take account of it.
Yeah.
So the International Theological Commission stuff is more sophisticated than its conclusions. Often.
Yes. Nice weather we're having. I'm not going there in public. How about this? Let's go on. Excuse me.
Sure. I'll try to make this one quick. So I'm noticing this is from the 50s. Where is or suggestions for where the church can be scientists? Has there been progression since its doctrine?
Yes. John Paul II, on several occasions, again, opens things to evolution in talks. More importantly than his talks is his gatherings of people in Rome, the scientific community and the theological community to discuss all sorts of things. That he models this conversation by inviting people and paying the bills as they have these conversations about cosmology as well as biological issues. They're not, and other scientific issues.
And it's very public apology for the Galileo and some of the other mistakes of the church. So that in a sense it's a real reversal of some of the predecessors' action.
Yeah.
So that's unprecedented.
Some of the humility that, yeah, I think it's tough for any big institution to have, but they slip it in.
He's a whole new ball.
Let's go eat and drink something.